I would hope that people who develop particular rites would act with some humility and not feel that whatever I think is great is necessarily great. We're part of a larger tradition, and that does not mean you do nothing, but it means you approach it with a bit of humility and realizing that everyone who went before us was not a fool and a robber, that they did the best they could in their circumstances. And I have been in contexts where experimental rites, as best I could discern, were whatever the rector popped into his head, often at the moment. And it really not very good, for one reason or another, you know. Now, if we're going to have experimental liturgies, I'm not saying nothing can be done until we know it's terrific. Because in fact, part of the learning process is to experience a liturgy and then have the courage to look at it critically. My formation in that was done in liturgies with children. And we did for 12 years, in addition to having lots of children at the Sunday Eucharist who shaped my priorities to a significant degree, but we also did about once every 5 or 6 weeks a liturgy geared for the children with members of the community, students and spouses, who would help in the formation of that rite. And for that, we did more or less the traditional structure of a gathering rite, a word rite, and a table rite. So in that sense, it was standard. But we did not use the Book of Common Prayer texts. And what we did was often to develop much of it embodied action of dance or mime or movement in some form, embodying a particular scripture reading. And it was really, again, I did not think we were being avant-garde. I found out later we really were being avant-garde, and it was not the intention. The intention was to introduce the children to the tactility of liturgical engagement, and that it was not simply behaving and sitting in a pew and being bored to death. One year I remember, I don't remember how early in my time at Nashotah, but a new student and his wife and their child came to this family liturgy, which I celebrated every Sunday in the Red Chapel. And at the end of that liturgy, the wife came up to me very agitated and said, "Father Weil, don't you realize these children will never be able to worship in a normal Episcopal church?" And I said, "That's right. That was my intention." And in that sense, it was subversive, because the parishes, our parish models, especially with regard to children, but also with regard to seniors and hearing or sight impaired people, must change. We address liturgies to the healthy 25 to 50 without intending it. I did a study on that for AARP several years ago. And you look at our hymns, and they all assume we're all healthy and vigorous. Now, what does this say to an 80-year-old who was dying of cancer but wants to be at church? That's not who he or she is, you know. So the children's experience for me was one which opened up unintentionally the path of experimentation. That's the first substantial experience I had. Some experience in Puerto Rico, but substantially the children's liturgies. And it really meant that how does one develop a particular liturgy for a particular occasion, for a particular group of people that engages their gifts and which is not necessarily going to be printed and published the next week and distributed in a printed version. And we could make mistakes. And what we did after the liturgy, once the children had had some fruit juice and went their way, we often did it on Saturday morning, we would then gather for 30 to 60 minutes and say, what did we intend? What happened? What did not unfold the way we thought it would? It was tremendous learning experience. And to be able to say, that really didn't work. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, what I'm implying, however, is we didn't do that at the principal liturgies in the main chapel. I think it is the most fruitful and sensitive way to address liturgical change is to begin with, for example, a study group or some subgroup in the parish or a group of people who are interested in doing a little extra study of the liturgy, and to do experiments before you bring it into the principal Sunday liturgy. So you have 11. You have people who have tested the language, who have tested the new hymns. And frankly, I've had so much success with this over the years, I have to think that it is basically a good working model. And with these liturgies, with children, we were brave enough to fail. And therefore, often, things were simply marvelous. I remember for a children's Easter Vigil, we did Holy Saturday, each year for children, no more than 45 minutes. That's the attention span. And this particular year, we had some students who were terrific at mime and embodiment. And we did Moses bringing the people of God, children of Israel, through the Red Sea. And we had children who were the waves and children who were with Moses. And it was absolutely marvelous. And they sensed what the biblical narrative talked about because it was embodied for them. Now, I would like to hope that it was not necessarily denied to adults as well.
I remember a priest once saying to me, when we were in the first throes of new liturgies, what will I do next that's new under the big top? And I said to him, you know, liturgy by its nature requires repetition. And symbols need to be articulated over and over again. And it's not a question of every week being new. It's a question of the symbols going deeper and deeper and deeper and forming us. So I think, first of all, there is the understanding, what's the nature of liturgy? And if it's an encounter with Christ, which is, I think, the safest way, an encounter with Christ mediated through word and symbol, then I think you need to look at what has the tradition given us in terms of word and symbol that we value, and what are the elements that are pressing upon us immediately that demand some kind of response. And then how do you put these things together, again with some kind of tension? I mean, I, quite frankly, have experienced a number of Eucharistic prayers that have been written that are simply terrible. And I don't mean terrible from a literary point of view, they may have been fine, but theologically, I thought the person who did this had absolutely no idea what goes into a Eucharistic prayer. I mean, talk about sort of anamnesis as the full flow of everything from creation through resurrection, and oriented toward the fulfillment of all history. You know, that's the proper frame of reference. They would write in some very narrow way about streams and trees. And it would all be creation-based, which was fine, but it would stop there. And then, yes, there'd be the words of Jesus. We simply go from, the beauty of creation to the Last Supper, and then that would sort of end. And I thought, if in some way the Eucharistic prayer is the proclamation of the gospel, then this was hardly the gospel. Being clever, I think people need to be protected against the ineptitudes of many people who think of good ideas liturgically. I remember this liturgy in which I was supposed to put rocks into something or other, and the rocks were meant to symbolize my getting rid of my sins, but it was so tortured, and no one really knew what on earth we were doing. And I thought, someone had this bright idea, and someone said, that's great, but where did it really sort of fit, or without killing it with previous explanation? That's the other thing. I mean, if you have to explain a symbol to some sort of extreme degree, then it's no longer a symbol. So, again, sort of what speaks? I mean, a real loaf of bread, broken, speaks in a way. I remember this a woman coming into church in Philadelphia when I was rector. She was Jewish by background. She was going through a terrible divorce. She was driving by the church. She saw that there was a service. She came, and we were gathered around the table, and I had a big loaf of bread. And afterwards she said to me, "It's about being fed, isn't it?" And she said, "I'm so hungry." And I thought, she gets it. She gets it, because the symbol, now if we were to do little wafers, she would have thought, well, what on earth are they doing with those things? So, again, what is the symbol, what do we have in the symbol trunk that we don't have to reinvent, but maybe use with greater care, saying, how can this proclaim, how can Christ speak through how we break the bread? So it's complicated. I mean, of course, too, with everyone able to print their whole service week by week, all kinds of very, very worthwhile things happen, but also some pretty odd and disorienting things happen as well. And again, I mean, it's often congregations at the mercy of the cleric. So I think if you're going to do this, if you're going to write liturgies, I would say, let's study, first of all, the Eucharistic prayer. Let's actually do some study. What is it for? What is it about? What is its sort of classic content? And then how do we take that classic content, which is valid in our own day, but maybe express it in ways that are fresh, as opposed to, what can I make up that comes out of my own cleverness that may not, in fact, be rooted in the sort of broader proclamation.
One of the problems with some aspects of liturgical renewal, as I've seen it in different parts of the world, is, and I had the privilege of lecturing on this 2 years ago at Swanning, is that the horizontal often was given full tilt and a total eclipse of the vertical. I can understand this as a reaction against the medieval, which was pure vertical. and very little horizontal, if any. It seems to me the imperative is the balance of the two. And I have been to liturgies in which I think the awareness that this is first of all God's initiative to us has been eroded by the style of the celebration, and it becomes an event just among us. I don't think this is necessarily intentional, but it does happen, and I've seen it. I think we need to remember that apart from God's initiative, the sacraments are meaningless. They're first of all God's reaching out to us in forms which, again, we understand in our humanity. God takes the ordinary and communicates, though through ordinary means, God's own presence. What more could one imagine? But now the horizontal dimension is the important complement to that, namely that our response is not just one-on-one, God and me, but rather I am a member of a community of faith, and therefore within the Eucharist it is a corporate action. I've said to students many times over the years, I think that still for many, many people, communion is essentially a private experience. And how can we understand that the broken bread, and one significant way of embodying that is a loaf of bread broken and shared rather than individual hosts, is to understand that the one bread, as Justin said in the year 150, as Justin said in the year 150, the bread represents to us one bread, the one body. In other words, our identity is embodied in that. So we see the bread on the altar. Or as Augustine said, behold your mystery, become what you see, become the one bread. This is awesome. This is awesome. But we again have an inherited piety of many hundreds of years, which has privatized the sacramental experience, so that somehow our education has to be very realistic about that filter that is operating in our culture, that religion is essentially a private affair, and thus, if I reject it, it's just my own private business, But to understand that Christian faith preeminently is a corporate response, and the Eucharist embodies that because it is a gathering of people, cross-cut of the whole society, ideally. High, low, rich and poor, black, white, every color, every nation, ultimately is what we're talking about. And that comes together in a common action engaging our Creator. And this is an extraordinary thing. It's certainly not a private thing. The private dimension is the way that operates in my own individual life. But that, in a sense, is important, but it's derivative.
Well, there are all kinds of problems about whether we are passing out of the Gutenberg era and are as dependent on print as we once were. But clearly one of the lessons of Gutenberg era and print is if we're going to have a sense of community and people hold together around intelligibility, it requires some kind of structure. that for a protracted corporate event, it can't just wander associationally. You have to do one kind of thing, and then you stop doing that and do something else. And there needs to be some reason why one follows from the other. So we were very aware of that in the whole prayer book. The 28 book had a lot of good structure, but it had it because the medieval rites from which the prayer book was evolved had, and they came from the early church. Then we'd had the work of Dix on the shape of the liturgy, which made one aware that the rite can vary quite a lot in language and detail and in enactment, and still have a common interior shape. And we felt in all cases bound by that, either by an old shape or a modern adaptation of it, but in any case by something that spoke of an intelligible action. Assuming that new rite would take the form of words spoken and perhaps written first, anybody who's working on rites needs to be alert to language. Almost all of our key members of the committee were quite conversant with literature. Bonnie Spencer, our chair, was quite theatrical. He'd acted a good deal, and so he not only knew words on the page, he heard them spoken, and that's a real knack. And it's a knack that people don't necessarily acquire by modern education. You can write perfectly acceptable thesis pages that are impossible to read aloud, and you could get high marks from your advisors for it. This is a special language for thesis writing, or for medical language, or for legal, you name it, all for theological. But liturgy is spoken, and it can't be overwritten or theatrical, because you're going to use it week after week, if you are, and something that might sound all right once doesn't wear well necessarily. So that would be one thing, just keep alert for the sound of words.
And theological
I'm
content.
just going to say that next. It needs to have a theology, and it needs to be the theology of the church. If you're writing for some special group, it's another thing, but you're writing for the church. And you're writing in a tradition. The liturgical acts of the church are as old as the church, and some of them have had a lot of common language and common ideas since, well, Augustine and Cyprian and Irenaeus set their minds to thinking things a long time ago. In our time, theology has come to mean so much that I think sometimes it means almost nothing. But there are theologies of this, that, and the other thing that fail to mention God, fail to have any connection with the Christian gospel. And the 79 prayer book was rooted in the theological tradition of the creeds and the scriptures and the gospel sacraments, and it coheres because of that. It was funny the way everybody in the committee could bounce around from early Christian antiquity to the Middle Ages to Reformation to the present and current life with utter ease. But that was particularly true of the scholars in the group. Lee Mitchell, Tom Talley, Louis Weil, and myself. We tried not to develop a little clique, so we were talking to each other and not to anybody else, but it was quite marked. We'd all had parish experience and pastoral needs and knew what people were going through today, and knew that the Christian message was always relevant. But we also knew the forms from the past, and we felt some covenant identity with people who were there before us. We sometimes thought they had it wrong, but most of the time we looked with gratitude to especially the deep past.
I'm troubled when a liturgy has to be completely one thing or the other. And I mean, I think expansive language, which I prefer to call it, rather than the denial of something, but the opening up of liturgical language. But I feel, yes, some of the prayers are in expansive language, but maybe you also do mention at some point Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so that they're, I mean, it's rather like choosing music for the liturgy. I mean, you can have classical music, classical church music, and you can also have something contemporary within the same liturgy. And so liturgical language in the course of the liturgy might both include something that comes out of the tradition and something that is new, both old and new, and that this kind of narrow, oh, it's got to be one thing or the other, I think is unfortunate, and let the two be in some kind of tension, a creative tension with one another. And then I think, I mean, for instance, the prayers of the people can always be in some very contemporary idiom. And maybe you have a classical liturgical text for the Eucharistic prayer, but you can have something really very progressive, if you want to put it that way, in terms of the prayers of the people, and certainly the homily. You know, I mean, that's another instance in which obviously contemporaneity is called for. So sort of having a sense that we don't deny one thing in order to go to something else, but we hold various pieces in some kind of tension, And I think that's probably what I would hope for as we look toward the future. Honoring the classical tradition, at the same time looking for ways in which language, imagery can be sort of expanded and made richer and fuller, and various pronouns can be employed or not employed, quite freely, because certainly there are some maternal imageries in Scripture that can well be used. And plus, people like St. Anselm and Julian of Norwich, and some of their texts have now been turned into canticles, which I think is both in the United States and in the New English, the Church of England daily office book. You find a number of these texts. So that's what I would hope for as we look to the future. I also think there are times when the transcendent is sort of consoling. I remember once someone who always came to our sort of creative liturgy on a Sunday morning, coming at 8 o'clock when we celebrated Rite One. And I said, I'm surprised to see you here, but of course, And she said, well, I'm here because my mother died, which I'd known. And she said, I just needed something that was more transcendent today. I just couldn't really have put up with the intimacy and contemporaneity of the 9:15. I needed the sort of the classical frame supplied by the Elizabethan language. Maybe we are various in our own sort of moods and needs, and maybe instead of saying, we need one form of language, liturgical language or liturgical celebration, recognizing the fact we may need several. And within any given congregation, without prejudging one or the other, we celebrate a number of ways.
The length of liturgical services, in my experience, is often, this will make a strange comment, needlessly lengthy. There is, I think, a misunderstanding that if something is important, it needs to be long. I have to say that in my experience, this is particularly an idea I find among my German friends, that if it's important, it has to go on forever. And I disagree with that radically. I think a major liturgy is long only if the constituent elements require a certain length. But to add on to that pieces to make it more important, I think is a very serious misreading of how liturgy works, because what happens is people leave that liturgy exhausted. I have seen this often where baptism is inserted into the Eucharist, and what you have inflicted, I have to say, on the laity is an extremely long rite for which they have not been adequately catechized and don't really understand why this has to be at the Sunday liturgy. That's another great concern of mine, the lack of adequate adult formation with regard to this kind of question. But the particular issue in the rite that is in the prayer book is that, if you remember, there's a rubric that the Gloria in Excelsis may be used. I proposed at the time that it not be in its full text at that point in the liturgy. And my reason was that if it is a major day, then of course the Gloria would be done by the nature of the feast. but that if the baptism was taking place in some other time, there was no real reason why the Gloria was called for and would lengthen the rite. This was just one little element in my concern that we not have a rite that just seemed to go on forever and ever. And I think to a great extent, many laity have had this happen to them. They don't know what is wrong, but they know they leave the liturgy worn out. I think that is really a very sad failure, because one should leave the liturgy lifted. I have, in fact, taken part in a 4-hour Easter vigil where I left the church feeling energized because everything in that liturgy was appropriate to what we were doing for the vigil celebration. That's quite a different thing from just sticking in one thing after another to make it long and therefore important. I think that's a mistake. So, of course, the Gloria would be used if it's on Pentecost, for example, obviously. But why should it be used if it is on some other Sunday of the year at the discretion of the rector or the bishop or whatever? I just don't see the reason for that. One of the important things that I think in Anglicanism really is a kind of pivotal turn after World War II, where for the first time really, revision of Anglican prayer books began to look at the cultural foundation where each province uses that book. I think that it's very important for us, if we are genuinely a Catholic Church, which I believe we are, that we are able to embrace the diversity of cultures. I was having a nightcap several years ago in Toronto with a parish priest there who was trained at Oxford and is very much an Anglophile and a splendid priest. But he said to me that in Toronto at that point, he said there are 13 or 14 substantial diverse ethnic communities. And then he said, I don't believe Anglicanism can embrace that kind of diversity. And I said, then we are doomed, if that were to be true, to being an Anglo ghetto. And I reject that totally. It seems to me that if we are true of what we say we are, we need to understand that the fundamental values of our tradition can be embodied, planted in other cultural, social contexts. Having said that, which is easy to say, it is staggeringly difficult. It is awesomely difficult. First of all, we have tended to work out of an Anglo or even an American Anglo bias. And that's the model we've worked from. And change usually begins by putting minor adjustments on the familiar model. But we get to a point where that type of minimalist adjustment to another culture is not really adequate. And local pastors in a particular congregation, in a particular community, dealing with ethnic pluralism, or dealing with some particular group within American society that has its own particular cultural identity, sets up imperatives that a sensitive pastor knows he or she must find ways to respect and to embody within the worship of the church. I talk about this with deep conviction, but with true anxiety, because it is very complex to do that. And if it were merely a question of two cultures, that would be hard enough. But we're dealing increasingly in a world that is marked by cultural pluralism and distinct identities based on, just to put it in the religious realm, very different religious formation. And it is certainly true that the emergence of a substantial Latino community in the American church poses this question in a dramatic way. I thank God for the fact that my first years after ordination were spent out of this country. 7 years in Latin America and 3 years in Europe. And I was constantly faced with other patterns of Anglicanism. And what I found when I first went to Puerto Rico was a prayer book and a hymnal which imitated the American prayer book and hymnal, even to the point of trying to have the prayers at the same place on the page as the American prayer book. In other words, that the Mother Church model determines the norm, and therefore the local culture must adapt to it. By the time I left Puerto Rico, there was enormous dissatisfaction with that, and the sense that we had to begin to develop whatever we understood as Anglican ethos at its best, but to express that ethos in a non-Anglo framework. I was challenged to do this by the Bishop of Ecuador many years ago. He asked me to go and live for 2 weeks with Quechua Indians, for whom their language is Quechua. Their second language is Spanish. My language is English. My second language is Spanish. So we had to use Spanish. That was our common language. And the bishop asked me to work with them in a basic liturgy course, and to help him discern the more gifted people who might go on to ordination or others to other ministries. And one of the projects which he asked us to do was to create a Eucharistic prayer in Quechua. Now, what I did, I would say now, is merely a preliminary stage. And that was to take the prayer A of the 1979 prayer book and to do the best I could to translate it through Spanish into Quechua. This is very tricky because I don't know Quechua. And what we would do is test the Spanish until we seemed to agree this is the Quechua equivalent, they would tell me, of this. And this led to an engagement with the imperatives of their culture, because when I talked to them about Eucharist as a corporate experience involving the whole community, they faced me with the rather awesome fact that men and women do not eat together. And I said, what do I do with that in the context of the Eucharist? And we explored what could be done. And one of them said to me, well, there's one exception. At a marriage, men and women eat together. And I realized that if we took marriage framework, the celebration of a marriage, which certainly has biblical roots, we could then look at the Eucharist in terms of a cultural pattern which they understood. in addition to language and respecting the language of another tradition, which, after all, language embodies in culture in a very particular way. This is why, for example, one can say something in one language that one can't really say in another language. This affects liturgical language very profoundly, you know. Another major area is the question of music, especially in culturally pluralistic parishes. It's challenging, and one of the worst mistakes that can be made is to do everything twice. Hymns and texts in both languages. It's liturgically deadly. In other words, if this is authentically pluralistic, the challenge is to develop models which bring the two cultures together. A wonderful example I saw of this was at, believe it or not, a liturgical congress in Germany many years ago, in the 70s, where our hosts, who were a Benedictine community, very astute liturgists, and when we had Vespers, all of our music was in 3 languages. We sang in German, French, and English, not one, but together. Newly composed music in the 3 languages simultaneously. Well, first of all, they had an excellent musician who had the gift to do this. Without the gift, you wouldn't do it very well, you know. But they saw this as an imperative in that context. And I think the same thing applies to us. If you're dealing with cultural pluralism, mutual respect and respect for each tradition requires an equal sharing of center stage. You know, it's not just who is in the primary place, who is in the secondary place. This certainly is true with music, and we need to develop skills to do that. But then there is the other issue with respect to the Latino community, which is very important in the light of the things that we have been proclaiming about the recovery of baptism in the life of the church, is that in the Latino community, under the influence of usually a Roman Catholic background, there is an emphasis on First Communion and a whole set of religious and social patterns that have developed around it. I only know this secondhand. I know it from work on the Standing Liturgical Commission because of Latinos who have shared with us that this plays a significant role in the life of that community. If I were the rector of such a community, I would feel that my first job was be to listen very carefully to what the underlying sense of this is within the community. And I can't presume without that to know what one could or should do. And I doubt that there would be a single model. But if you have, for example, an Anglo community combined with a Latino community, what do you say? Do you say, well, we'll have early communion for infants in the Anglo community, but we'll do the later pattern for the Latino community? Personally, I would feel this is a bit of a cop-out. How can you, as a parish, bring the whole community into a dialogue where some common ground could emerge? And I may be awfully naive, but I constantly feel if we can talk together and listen to each other, we can find a common place. If there is diversity that is absolutely necessary, different models, I would certainly not see that as the first option, but it might be a necessary transitional model. It might well be. I remember a parish years ago when I was in graduate school. It happened to be a Roman Catholic parish, which was a 2-level church. In the lower level, they did the Liturgy of Vatican II, and the upper level, they did the Tridentine Mass in Latin. Now, of course, the congregations for each were totally separate. They happened to be worshiping in the same church, but on two different levels, and they had nothing to do with each other. Well, that happens to be then two communities using the same building. That is not a joined together community. It is not that. So one has to explore, what is our goal? Is it merely to house two distinct congregations with distinct practices? I would hope that would be seen as a second or a later choice. But it might be necessary in some contexts. As a pastor, I would want to try every way possible to create a sense of mutuality between the two congregations, which would mean, I think, that there would be major times in the church year, even if it wasn't every Sunday, there would be major times in the church year when there would be one Eucharist for the entire community, where one could then explore the musical, the ritual dimensions that could be shared. And this might mean that, in fact, a new repertory would emerge that is neither the music of the one or the other, but a music developed for the particular identity of that parish. It's a treacherous issue, and it's an issue which Anglicanism has been tentatively trying to address really since the 50s. When we did the first conference here at CDSP in 1999, we named it Unbound, exclamation point. This was misunderstood by a great many people. But the meaning of it was unbound by an Anglo-religious basis. What does it mean to take Anglicanism out of that framework and put it into a larger context? I feel it's imperative, but I don't think it is possible to establish a single model, because the variations are going to be enormous between one community and another. And that means that, inevitably then, the particularities have to feed into the shaping of a model that works in that community. Does that mean we lose our unity in the prayer book? Well, there's a serious question there, you know. On the other hand, I think the pastoral imperative is probably the primary imperative in that context. It would seem to me that if there's mutual respect and forbearance, then we will in fact find ways which we cannot anticipate at this point. It's not going to be business as usual. It's not going to be even the grinding out of a very good model that we've done relentlessly for 20 years. It means something new is going to emerge.